And now on the line is Jim Clarken, the CEO of Oxfam Ireland. Welcome to the program, Jim, and thanks for coming on.
Thanks very much, Darren. Good to be with you.
Okay, Jim, I've interviewed representatives of your organisation every January for the last few years about your annual international report on inequality with the World Economic Forum meeting in Davos. Could you start off, Jim, by reminding our listeners, please, to the background of how and why yourselves and Oxfam publish this report every January?
Sure. Well, as people will know, there's a major kind of gathering in Davos every year of some of the world's wealthiest people, as well as some of the world's biggest corporations, along with lots of political leaders. So there's a gathering of very elite and very influential people. And around this time every year, we produce a report focusing on that, just to remind those people who are in the room about some of the key issues facing the world, particularly the world's most vulnerable people, or the majority of the world in many instances. And this year is no different. And in recent years, we've had a specific focus on growing inequality and extreme inequality. So we've highlighted in previous years just how much wealth is being accumulated by the very small group of extraordinarily wealthy people in the world, and how much, and not, it's not, this isn't because we have a problem with very wealthy people, it's because the impact that has on the rest of the world, particularly on those living in poor countries and poor parts of the world. And it is very extreme. And it's an opportunity for us to highlight that every year, to try and influence kind of the debate and the discussions that are happening around that, and remind those in the room that that the rest of the world is watching, and that what they do and the kind of decisions that come out of this are important, and they need to be aware of the implications for everybody else.
Yeah, as I said at the start of the interview, I've covered your annual report about that with the Davos meeting every year. I think since the first year you launched your report several years ago. And am I right in saying that what encouraged you to kind of bring out this report every year was that, like, the level of inequality has been growing to obscene levels for several years now, has it?
It has, and I mean, we've, even in this year's report, for example, we talk about the 10 wealthiest men, and they're all men in the world. Their actual fortunes more than doubled during this past year, during the pandemic, during this 2 years of the pandemic. So they went from owning 610 billion, these 10 people, to owning 1.3 trillion. So that's an average, a rate of 1.13 billion every single day during the pandemic. And the reason that it's important to highlight that is because 99% of the world's population are worse off following the pandemic. Nearly everybody, everybody in the world has been impacted by the pandemic. Nearly everybody has had a negative impact on their income, on their capacity to, to live financially. And, it's reached obscene levels. And we see that, during the time of this pandemic, it's estimated that 126 million more people will end up in extreme poverty. So that's below the international recognized poverty line. And we had been slowly moving backwards on that over recent years. And this, we'd been slowly eroding that the huge number of people that live in extreme poverty, but it's going backwards. And that, these aren't about numbers. These are about real people. These are about the impacts that it has on people. So we've seen, the impact it has on healthcare, the impact it has on hunger, and the impact that it has on climate, and the fact that climate change is affecting the poorest people in the world. So, and obviously we've seen over this pandemic period a huge growth in the violence against women and girls. So what we're saying in the report is that, if more focus was put on, how these extraordinarily wealthy people can contribute to addressing some of these big global issues, it would make a difference. It would make a substantial difference, and that's what we're calling for in the report.
Am I right in saying that most of the extra wealth the people, the 10 billionaires have got since COVID, and even going back over the last several years in general, most of this increased wealth is on the stock exchange, and it's in assets as well, like kind of housing and kind of like assets, that kind of way. Is that right? Is it?
Yeah, it's in wealth that they hold, and it is in the appreciation of that wealth. But it's important to remember that at the start of the pandemic, the U.S. Fed and the European Central Bank invested billions and billions and billions of euros and dollars into the financial markets, with a view to bolstering those to avoid a crash, which was, economically was what they had decided to do. But the effect of that has been massive growth in those, in those stock exchanges, and those really extraordinarily wealthy people who hold the majority of these stocks, then as a result got a lot wealthier. Whereas, that's public money that's invested, with an intention of keeping the economy stable, and that's, that was the fiscal policy, but it has had the impact of really bolstering the wealth of these people. And what we're saying is that, it's not right that a very small group of people became extraordinarily additionally wealthy when so many others are suffering from this, and that now is the time to introduce a form of wealth tax that will help to rebalance that.
I'm glad you mentioned that. I was just going to ask you that about the stock exchange and wealth in general. I follow some economic people on social media, people like Peter Schiff, who are good, and they're good at explaining how the super rich have got richer over the years, even since the last pandemic. I understand what most and Peter and some others have to say, but I find it hard for it to register with me how governments like the ECB, and the US Federal Reserve, how their quantitative easing intended to stimulate economies of the world mostly finds its way to the super rich on the stock exchange. Could you explain how this could happen, Jim? Or this does happen?
Well, it's not that it all goes to the super rich, but they're the ones that have benefited the most. Now, I think economists would be better positioned than myself to do the analysis of how effective these have been. But we haven't seen crashes of stock markets globally as a result of the pandemic, which I guess is a positive thing in lots of ways. So, I'm sure that it was well intended, those investments. But and look, we've had, in some parts of the world, in this part of the world, we've had relative economic stability. Certainly, that's not the case elsewhere in the world. It's, Ireland thankfully was in a position to be able to borrow a lot of money to be able to invest in pandemic supports. Other countries not so much, and we're seeing poorer countries now engaging in huge austerity programs to claw back the losses to their economies during this period. We're seeing many countries where 2/3 of middle income and lower income countries are reducing their education budgets, for example, as part of the austerity programs that they now believe they have to put in place because they don't have the kind of protections that other economies do. So there is a global economic impact as well, and it's not equal. It's not, it is spread differently, and poorer countries are going to be the ones that will suffer the most. And there also, it's important to remember that poor countries have been more affected by the pandemic in other ways. I mean, we have been campaigning along with the People's Vaccine Alliance for vaccine equity, and just 10% of people living in the poorest countries in the world have been vaccinated. And outside of the huge health implications, the more people are dying in poorer countries than are dying anywhere else due to the pandemic. So outside of the moral argument and the shocking level of deaths and unnecessary deaths, it's having a huge impact on their overall economies as well. I mean, you have poor countries where you wouldn't have as many qualified doctors, nurses, medical professionals, and even those people are not protected, and they're dying at work because of their work. And then the knock-on the implications for communities that where casual employment, where those kind of economic models are quite different to here. And they don't have the social protection when there are lockdowns, when there are closed downs, and those kind of things. We also see the huge implications for women and girls it's estimated, the ILO estimated that women across the world have lost $800 billion of their earnings during the pandemic. It's an extraordinary amount of money. And then you see that it's estimated that 20 million girls that, were taken out of school when the schools closed down in developing countries will not go back to school. So the impact for them, for their entire lives, for their families, for their communities is enormous. And even the gender pay gap, which was slowly being eroded, has now gone back again, they estimate, by a generation. So there are huge knock-on implications for this across the world, and particularly in poorer countries. And it just seems wrong at every level that a very small group of people could retain and grow extraordinary wealth when everybody else is suffering.
Okay, Jim, you mentioned a couple of policies there. You mentioned a few things, but what are you calling for in this report, both in an Irish context and in an international context?
Well, what we want to see is some form of wealth tax, and what could be done is governments could look at the extraordinary increases during the pandemic period. So the kind of numbers that I mentioned about those 10 richest men, even in Ireland, the 9 billionaires in Ireland, again all men, their wealth has increased by 58% during this period. So some people have gained tremendously from this, during the time of the pandemic for different reasons. And we're saying it just seems right that there should be some level of maybe a one-off taxation on the extra gains that were made, but then we need to have a further debate about wealth tax generally. So I mean, we do see, the wealthiest people in the world are not subject to are not subject to a fair level of taxation that the rest of society shares, and it's the accumulation of this extraordinary amount of wealth doesn't actually support economies. It doesn't benefit economies. It benefits those individuals. Those individuals will never spend all that money in multiple lifetimes. So it's not economically progressing either. So it just makes sense for there to be some form of taxation that brings some of that money back in the possibility to invest in public, in social support in Ireland and across the world.
Okay, it's been a few days, James, since you launched this year's report. Are you happy with the media coverage and feedback you've got on the report since?
Yeah, we've had very strong media coverage, which is very helpful, and it's starting debates. I mean, we don't, as Oxfam, claim to have all the answers for these things, but it is important to have these debates, and it is important to seed kind of discussions on things like wealth taxes, on redistributive ways of ensuring that there are investments into protecting those most vulnerable and social services and fighting violence against women and girls and all the kind of things that public funding could support if it was there, housing in Ireland, for example. So I think it started a debate. Well, it's not started, it's contributed to a debate, which is an important one, and we're hoping that debate will continue. And just to say that, we're often told that things are impossible, and then until they become possible. So the idea of a wealth tax is something that has, we were told years ago that the idea of some form of corporate tax cooperation across the world was impossible. And then we have the OECD process, the BEPS process, then we see Ireland, becoming part of that, and we see some positive changes happening across the world. So it is important to start these conversations. It's important for them to be picked up and those debates to happen. And then it's important to progress these kind of key issues to make sure that economies work for everybody, that everybody has an opportunity to have good healthcare, social protection, fair work, and that we bridge the gap between women and men and produce a society that's equal for everybody.
Okay, Jim, before you go, is there anything else you want to tell our listeners on the FM about your work in Oxfam fighting inequality over the next few months?
Well, we have a particular focus now on trying to put pressure on Ireland and the European Union to sign up to what's called the TRIPS waiver at the World Trade Organization to allow the intellectual property and know-how for vaccines to be shared. Currently, it's owned by just a very small group of companies, monopoly situation. There are not enough vaccines being produced. They're not being distributed into poor countries particularly. There is a solution to this, which is to share the intellectual property to allow the companies, and we have identified sites across the world that could produce vaccines if they had the recipes and the know-how. It's important to remember that these vaccines were developed with tremendous public money support, so they were paid for by taxpayers across the world, and it's only right and proper that they should be shared. We've always said that nobody's safe until everybody's safe. Very large percentage of the population is not safe. Unless we get people vaccinated, we'll continue to see variants emerge. We'll continue to see disruption in lives across the world. We'll continue to see suffering, death, and misery in places. And it's unnecessary. There's a solution that's staring us in the face. We need to see Ireland and the European Union support this to push out the possibility for vaccines for everybody.